She had money, power, and influence. He had nothing but calloused hands and a daughter he would die to protect. But together they uncovered a secret at her ex-husband's wedding that changed everything and proved that sometimes love grows in the ashes of destruction. Victoria Hale stood motionless at the enormous window of her Riverland estate, the glass, stretching from floor to ceiling and spilling sunlight over the polished marble floor. She had been staring out for so long that the world beyond the glass had blurred. The gentle slope of the lawn, the broad shadows of the old plane trees, the sparkle of the fountain. None of it registered. Her tablet buzzed on the table behind her, alerting her to messages from her executive assistant about the upcoming board meeting, the overseas call she was supposed to join, the quarterly projections she was expected to recite from memory. Normally, she thrived on such reminders. Each notification a small confirmation of her control. But today, she didn't even turn around. On the screen of her phone lay the words that had pulled her into this paralysis. "You'll come to my wedding, Vic? It'll be beautiful." The message from Nathan Parker, her ex-husband, was short, almost playful, and yet it stabbed deeper than any corporate ambush she had ever faced. The memory of him, their dinners with investors, their smiles for cameras, the way he had betrayed her with a kind of careless grace, flooded her mind. Now he wanted her presence, her acknowledgement of his new beginning. For him it was spectacle. For her it was humiliation. She could imagine it already. The crowded vineyard hall, the whispers from rivals, the laughter muffled behind champagne glasses. Look at her, the millionaire CEO, left behind, walking in alone. The thought twisted in her stomach. She had fought too hard for her position, clawed her way to the top of a company that had never wanted her there in the first place, and she could not let them see her broken. She refused. But if she didn't go at all, it would be worse. A headline in itself, proof that Nathan still had the power to unnerve her. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her with cool brown eyes and perfectly painted lips. But beneath the flawless exterior, there was a tremor she hated. She clenched her fists at her sides. Somewhere deep inside, she longed not for another executive, not for another polished name to accompany her, but for someone who would stand there quietly, simply by her side, not as a prop, but as an anchor. Her gaze drifted past the window, down to the green lawns. There he was, Ethan Brooks, bending over a flower bed, his hands deep in the earth. He wore the same navy work shirt and sturdy boots he always wore, his dark hair damp from the labor of the morning. He moved with a slow steadiness, as though nothing could rattle him, as though the world's noise had no hold on him. Nearby, a girl rode her bike in circles, her laughter rising above the chirp of birds. Sophia, his 8-year-old daughter, a child who seemed to carry sunlight in her pockets even on the cloudiest days. Victoria had never thought of Ethan as more than her gardener. He had been working for her for nearly a year, tending to the gardens that her guests complimented, but that she rarely visited. Yet in recent months she had noticed things. How he never lingered when she came outside, never stared too long the way some men did. How his daughter always brought her homework or a toy rabbit when she came, and how Ethan's eyes softened in ways they never did for anyone else. There was an integrity in him that unsettled her, not because it was threatening, but because it was rare. She stepped out onto the terrace, heels clicking against the stone, and called down, "Mr. Brooks." He looked up, squinting against the light, and wiped his forehead with the back of his arm. "Ethan, ma'am," he said in his quiet, steady way, as though he had corrected her a dozen times before. She descended the steps slowly, gathering the folds of her dark dress around her, until she was close enough to see the dirt embedded in his hands, the way his chest rose and fell with calm exertion. For a moment she didn't speak, and he didn't press her. He simply waited, shovel resting lightly against the soil. "I have a request," she began, her voice sharper than she intended. "Unusual, probably inappropriate." He tilted his head slightly, the faintest crease between his brows, but he stayed silent, inviting her to continue. "I've been invited to a wedding," she said at last. Her throat felt tight. "My ex-husband's. He expects me to appear. If I don't, it will be a victory for him. If I go alone, it will be worse. I need someone. Someone I can trust to stand with me." The words spilled out before she could stop them, and she hated how desperate they sounded. For a heartbeat, shame burned in her chest. She, Victoria Hale, millionaire CEO, asking her gardener to play escort. It was absurd. But Ethan only studied her with that same calm steadiness. No flicker of surprise, no smirk, no judgment. After a pause that stretched long enough for her to wonder if he would refuse, he nodded once. "If it helps you keep your back straight," he said quietly, "then I'll go." Something inside her cracked at the simplicity of his answer. No conditions. No hidden motives. Just a promise spoken like fact. She had expected pity, or curiosity, or even the hesitation of someone stepping far outside his world. But what she saw instead was a kind of loyalty she hadn't encountered in years. For the first time since she had read Nathan's message, her chest loosened. The battle ahead would still be brutal, but she would not walk into it alone. Ethan Brooks was a man who carried silence the way others carried a weapon. It wasn't the silence of indifference or awkwardness, but of a person who had learned that words rarely fixed anything. He rose before dawn every day, brewed the same bitter coffee in a dented steel pot, and walked with his daughter Sophia to the small staff cottage on the Hale estate. From there, his routine rarely changed. Pruning hedges, checking irrigation, clearing the beds of weeds, coaxing beauty out of soil that others only saw as ornament for their garden parties. The world saw him as a gardener, nothing more. But inside him lived a story far heavier than dirt and roots. 5 years earlier, his life had broken in two. A car accident on a rain-slick highway had stolen his wife in an instant, leaving Ethan with a 4-year-old child and a mountain of grief that pressed against his chest day and night. He had been 29 then, strong in body but crushed in spirit, suddenly both father and mother, nurse and teacher, protector and provider. Friends drifted away, pity gave way to distance, and what remained was just him and Sophia. She had been the reason he didn't collapse entirely. Her laughter, even through tears, was the thread he clung to when the nights felt endless. In the years that followed, Ethan took whatever jobs he could find, construction, hauling, night shifts in warehouses, until steady work appeared in the form of tending the grounds of Victoria Hale's estate. To most it was just physical labor, but to him it was survival, and in some ways, salvation. Plants didn't lie, they didn't betray. They responded to care, to water, to patience. Watching something grow under his hands gave him a sense of control he'd thought was gone forever. Sophia became a familiar sight on the estate, small and lively, often pedaling her bicycle in circles while Ethan worked. She adored the gardens almost as much as he did, crouching in the dirt to poke at worms, asking endless questions about why roses needed pruning and why lavender smelled like sleep. When Ethan saw her there, her dark hair blowing in the wind, her face alight with curiosity, he felt a flicker of something he rarely allowed himself: hope. Though he never spoke of it, Victoria had noticed details. She noticed how he never looked up when she passed in her tailored suits, never lingered with that mix of awe and envy that most men carried in her presence. She noticed the evenings he stayed past dark to repair broken swings or mend the fence near the orchard. Not because anyone asked him to, but because Sophia liked to play there. And she noticed, though he tried to hide it, the payments he made each month to a hospital far from Riverland. Once, a misdirected receipt had landed on her assistant's desk, and she'd seen the clinic's name: oncology. She never asked whom he was helping, but she knew the sacrifice it must have taken from a man who had so little to spare. Ethan did not complain about his life, not once. If a storm tore down branches, he simply cleared them. If the summer sun burned his back red, he drank water, pulled his cap lower, and kept working. He was not a man given to dreams of wealth or status. His world was simpler, but also heavier. Raise Sophia, keep her safe. Keep her believing that the world was not only loss. At night, after Sophia fell asleep with her rabbit toy tucked under her chin, Ethan would sometimes sit at the small wooden table in the cottage, staring at old photographs, his wife laughing at something off camera. Sophia, barely a toddler, clinging to her mother's legs. He would sit there until the weight in his chest threatened to crush him, then quietly fold the photos away again. He did not allow himself to break, not in front of Sophia, not in front of anyone. It was this quiet strength, this steady refusal to collapse, that made him different from the men Victoria knew in her world of glass towers and boardrooms. Where they filled silences with jargon and promises, Ethan filled them with presence. Where they disguised their weaknesses with bravado, He carried his scars openly, though he never spoke of them. When Victoria asked him to accompany her to her ex-husband's wedding, Ethan did not question her motives. He did not wonder why a millionaire CEO would turn to a gardener for such a request. He simply understood that she needed someone, and for a man who had lived years defined by loyalty to a child, the idea of standing beside someone in their moment of need was not foreign. He did not see himself as a rescuer or as anyone's equal in her world of power. He was, in his own eyes, a man who worked with soil, who tried to keep one little girl safe and warm. But deep inside him lay an instinct that Victoria had glimpsed and that he barely acknowledged in himself. The instinct to step forward when no one else would. And though neither of them could have known it then, that instinct was about to be tested in ways that would bind their lives together forever. The day of the wedding arrived with a crispness in the air that seemed almost deliberate, as though the weather itself wanted to sharpen the edges of what was about to unfold. Victoria Hale had dressed with the precision of a woman preparing for battle, not celebration. Her dark gown clung to her frame with a severity that matched the set of her jaw. Jewelry glittered at her ears and wrists, but it was chosen not for beauty, but for armor. Signals of wealth, authority, and control. The limousine that carried her wound slowly through the vineyard hills, every turn bringing her closer to the confrontation she had spent nights dreading. Ethan sat beside her in the back seat, his broad shoulders filling more space than the suit jacket he wore seemed prepared for. He looked uncomfortable, not in the clothes themselves. They fit him well enough, though borrowed from a tailor who had measured him in silence, but in the spectacle of it all. He adjusted his cuff once, then gave up, resting his large hands on his knees. Where Victoria's mind raced, calculating every whisper and every glance she would face, Ethan appeared carved out of stillness. His calm did not lessen her tension, but it steadied her, gave her something to anchor against. "You don't have to say anything tonight," she told him abruptly, her voice low. "In fact, it's better if you don't." He turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes steady. "I didn't plan to. I'm here to stand next to you, nothing more." For a moment she almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of the sheer simplicity of it. In her world, every agreement came with conditions, every promise with subtext. But Ethan's words carried none of that. Just presence. Just enough. When they arrived, the venue was already alive with the hum of voices and the clinking of crystal. The vineyard stretched wide behind the glass-paneled event hall, rows of grapes bathed in golden light from the setting sun. Guests spilled across the terrace, men in tuxedos, women in silk and jewels, the air thick with perfume and gossip. The moment Victoria stepped from the car, the atmosphere shifted. Heads turned, conversations paused. Cameras clicked softly from hands that pretended they weren't holding phones. And then they saw Ethan, emerging behind her. His presence drew a second wave of whispers, sharper this time, edged with derision. "Is that her date?" a woman murmured, loud enough for others to hear. "A gardener, I heard. Bold choice," a man chuckled under his breath. "She's finally lost it," another voice whispered. Victoria heard them all. Every syllable scraped against her nerves, but she kept her chin high, her hand steady on Ethan's arm. She refused to let them see the tremor beneath her skin. Ethan, for his part, didn't flinch, didn't glance at the crowd. His eyes were fixed forward, as though the stares and whispers were leaves rustling in a distant tree. Noise, but nothing more. Inside, the hall glowed with chandeliers and candlelight, polished to an elegance meant to impress. And at the center of it all stood Nathan Parker, her ex-husband, immaculate in his tuxedo, smiling that practiced smile she once knew so well. He moved through the crowd with the ease of a man convinced of his charm, and when he finally spotted her, his expression shifted to something closer to triumph. "Victoria," he said warmly as he approached, his voice dripping with feigned affection. "You made it." His eyes flicked briefly to Ethan, then back, a flash of confusion before he smoothed it over with a smirk. "And you brought company." "This is Ethan Brooks," Victoria said calmly. She offered nothing more. Ethan extended his hand with quiet composure, and when Nathan shook it, his smile faltered just slightly at the unexpected strength of Ethan's grip. The bride appeared then, Ava Lawrence, younger, polished, her beauty sharp in a way that reminded Victoria of a blade gleaming in the sun. She avoided Victoria's eyes, and when their gazes did cross, she looked away too quickly. Victoria saw it in that flicker. The unease, the knowledge that this union was not as flawless as it appeared. Dinner followed, courses arriving like choreography, wine glasses refilling as though by magic. Victoria endured the toasts, the laughter, the smug glances from across the table. Her face remained composed, but her chest was tight. When the slideshow began on the great screen behind the bandstand, her pulse quickened. It was meant to be a celebration of Nathan and Ava's new life. Photos of travels, of parties, of smiles too wide. And then, for a single fleeting moment, an image appeared that froze her. The greenhouse, her greenhouse, or rather what remained of it. The charred frame, blackened earth, smoke still lingering in the photo's edges. It had been nearly a year since the fire. Officials had written it off as an accident, but the suspicion had always clawed at her, that someone wanted it gone, that it had been deliberate. Seeing it here, in this place, projected on a wall as though it were part of some casual backdrop, it was like a knife twisting inside her. She felt Ethan's gaze shift toward her, though he said nothing. When she turned her head, she saw his jaw tighten, his hands curling slightly on the tablecloth. It was the smallest of gestures, but it told her more than words could have. He knew something. The laughter of the crowd continued, oblivious. The music swelled, but for Victoria the evening had changed. Whatever facade she had intended to maintain was cracking. She had come here prepared to withstand humiliation, but now she sensed something darker beneath the surface. Something that threatened to unravel more than her pride. And as she sat there, her pulse racing, she realized the only person who seemed to understand that weight was the gardener by her side. The moment the image of the burned greenhouse disappeared from the screen, replaced by smiling photos of Nathan and Ava sipping champagne on some beach, Victoria could no longer hear the room around her. The clinking of glasses, the soft laughter, even the quartet's delicate strings faded into a distant hum. Her mind had tunneled into that single image. The skeletal beams of glass and steel reduced to ash, the soil scorched black. The place that once pulsed with her ambition and her vision turned into ruin. It wasn't only the destruction of a structure, it was the theft of her pride, her faith in her own untouchable success. Her hand tightened unconsciously around the stem of her wine glass until the crystal groaned under the pressure. She forced herself to let go before it shattered. She glanced sideways, and for the first time that night she caught Ethan watching her, his dark eyes not filled with judgment, but with something closer to gravity. He leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough to be drowned out by the music. "I was there that night," he murmured. Victoria's head snapped toward him. "What do you mean?" she whispered, sharper than she intended. He didn't look at her directly. His gaze remained on the table, on the silverware, as though he were speaking not to her, but to the memory itself. "I was on a late shift. They had me tending the back hedges, near the service road. I heard voices near the delivery bay. Two men, one of them on the phone. I didn't catch every word, but I remember enough. 'Insurance will cover it,' he said. 'Hale will get the message.'" Ethan's jaw tightened. And then a name, clear as day, Nate. For a moment, Victoria couldn't breathe. The air seemed to disappear, sucked out of the room, leaving her in a vacuum where only Ethan's words existed. She turned her head slowly toward the far side of the hall, where Nathan was laughing at a joke from one of his associates, his arm draped easily around Ava's shoulders. His smile was bright, his posture confident, as though the entire room existed to orbit him. And yet in Victoria's ears, Ethan's voice echoed, "Nate." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She tried again. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I have Sophia," he said simply, finally turning his eyes back to her. "I couldn't risk bringing trouble to our door. I needed to be sure. I've been gathering what I could. Copies, scraps, proof that wouldn't vanish under pressure. Noise doesn't protect anyone. Evidence does." The weight of his words crashed down on her, harder than the whispers of the guests ever could. He had carried this knowledge quietly, carefully, for months, choosing silence not out of cowardice, but out of duty to his daughter. And yet tonight, when the image of the greenhouse flickered before them, he decided to share it. She felt a burn at the back of her throat, the kind she had trained herself to suppress in boardrooms and negotiations. But this time it broke through. A tear welled in her eye before she could stop it. She blinked hard, furious with herself, but the salt blurred her vision all the same. "Victoria," Ethan said softly, his tone steady, grounding. "He didn't destroy just your greenhouse. He wanted you to bend. He wanted you afraid." Her breath shuddered out of her chest. For years she had cultivated an image of perfection, flawless speeches, flawless posture, flawless control. But sitting here beside a man who had no stake in her empire, no reason to protect her reputation, she felt that armor slip. The realization was both terrifying and, in a way she hadn't expected, relieving. Around them, the celebration carried on without pause. Waiters circulated with trays of sparkling wine. Guests laughed too loudly, eager to be seen in each other's company. The world for them was glittering and secure. For Victoria, it had turned into something else entirely, a stage where every smile, every toast, every flicker of candlelight masked the rot beneath. And she now held a thread that could unravel it all. She stared down at her hands, pale against the black silk of her dress, and whispered, "If this is true, if he really ordered that, then it's not just betrayal, it's war." Ethan didn't flinch. He only nodded once, as though he had already accepted what she was just now beginning to understand. "Then you fight it," he said, "but not alone." The simplicity of those last words pierced deeper than any grand declaration could have. She lifted her gaze to meet his, and for the first time that night, she felt a crack of light inside the darkness. A reminder that strength wasn't always about standing alone. Sometimes it was about who chose to stand beside you. The rest of the hall blurred around her. The clinking of glasses resumed its place in her ears. The quartet's music returned in soft strains, but nothing would ever sound the same again. In that moment, between the glitter of chandeliers and the rot of secrets, Victoria Hale understood that tonight was only the beginning. The room was heavy with candlelight and perfume, but beneath the glittering surface, Victoria felt only the sharp hum of tension, like electricity crackling unseen. Nathan had risen to speak, his voice effortlessly charming, carrying over the clink of cutlery and the swell of the quartet. He raised his glass, smiling in that way he always did when he wanted the world to believe in his perfection. "Friends," as he began, "tonight is not only about love, it is about triumph. It is about beginning again, stronger, brighter." Victoria's hands were trembling under the table. Ethan's words from moments earlier still rang in her ears. "Insurance will cover it. Hale will get the message. Nate." She stared at her ex-husband, watching his lips form platitudes, watching the crowd nod and beam, and she felt the urge rise in her chest like a storm breaking. This was the man who had burned her dreams, who had tried to break her, and now he stood here, drinking to triumph. The word tasted like poison. Without warning, she stood. Her chair scraped loudly against the polished floor, the sound jarring enough to cut through Nathan's speech. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, curiosity flickering into whispers. Nathan faltered, his smile stiffening. "Victoria?" She lifted her chin. Her voice was calm, steady, but inside her heart was racing. "Before you toast to new beginnings, Nathan, perhaps your guests should hear about the ashes you left behind." A murmur rippled across the hall. Someone laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke. But Victoria reached into her clutch, withdrew her phone, and with a swipe, the recording Ethan had given her filled the speakers nearest the bandstand. The voices were faint but distinct, muffled tones, the mention of insurance, the phrase "Hale will get the message," and then, unmistakably, Nathan's name. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, sharp whispers, a few hands flying to mouths. Heads turned toward Nathan, his smile vanishing in an instant, replaced by a flash of something colder, rawer. Ava stiffened beside him, her hand tightening on her glass. The room seemed to tilt, the glittering perfection of the evening cracking like fragile glass. "That's a lie," Nathan barked, his voice louder than before, angrier. "A fabrication, a pathetic stunt." Victoria's lips curved into something between a smile and a snarl. "Then explain, Nathan, why your name is attached to delivery records of solvent shipments. Explain why the night my greenhouse burned, men on your payroll were heard talking about sending me a message." A chair scraped at the back of the room. A man was standing now, broad-shouldered, his presence quiet but authoritative. Detective Murphy, dressed in a plain suit that blended easily among the tuxedos, stepped forward. "I think I can help with that," he said, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of command. He held up a phone in one hand. "Because I've been following this trail for a year, and tonight I have the warrant to seize the books of your little charity fund." The hall erupted into chaos. Some guests whispered frantically, others stood, torn between curiosity and the instinct to flee scandal. Ava's face went pale, her eyes darting from Nathan to the detective. Realization dawning that the man she had just married was not only duplicitous, but reckless. Nathan stepped forward, fury blazing in his eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about. This is harassment, nothing more. You think you can ruin me with rumors?" His voice cracked just slightly, and that slight crack was enough to betray him. Ethan had already risen, moving with quiet precision. He didn't shout, didn't posture. He simply placed himself between Nathan and the path to the doors. Nathan glared at him, chest heaving, his fists clenched. "Move aside, Gardner," he hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. "For my friends, I'm Ethan," the man said evenly. "For you, just an obstacle." His stance was immovable, his presence suddenly larger than the chandeliers above them, larger than the murmurs of the crowd. Nathan made as if to push past him, but two uniformed officers entered the hall just then, their radios crackling, their presence sealing the shift from gossip to reality. The click of handcuffs snapped sharp through the din, more final than any toast or promise. Guests gasped, some raising phones, others averting their eyes. Victoria stood motionless, her phone still in her hand, her breath shallow. She had envisioned humiliating Nathan, had longed for it, but the reality was more complicated, more raw. She felt no triumph, no elation, only the release of a burden she had carried for far too long. Her knees wavered beneath the weight of it. Ethan's hand was suddenly at her elbow, steadying her, grounding her without a word. She turned her face up toward him and found no gloating, no satisfaction in his expression, just quiet strength, the same as always. He had stood beside her in silence and then, when the moment demanded, placed himself in harm's way without hesitation. As Nathan was led out, shouting protest to anyone who would listen, Victoria realized something startling. The battle wasn't over, it had only begun, but for the first time she no longer felt alone on the battlefield. And that, more than anything, was what threatened to bring her to tears. The wedding reception ended not in laughter or dancing, but in flashing lights and the sharp scent of fear. Guests scattered as police moved in, some too eager to escape the scandal, others lingering just long enough to whisper what they had seen. By the time the hall was emptied, Nathan Parker was in custody, his face pale with rage as cameras caught every step. The glittering evening had collapsed into chaos, and for Victoria Hale, it was only the beginning of a night that would change everything. The police escorted her and Ethan to a separate room, quiet and cold, where Detective Murphy laid out the foundation of his case. He spread papers across the table, receipts, copies of invoices, transfers buried in shell accounts. His voice was calm, methodical, as though reading a script he had rehearsed for months. "It all ties back to Nathan's charity fund," Murphy explained. "On the surface, it looked legitimate. Donations to community projects, clean financials. But dig a little deeper, and you find the same contractor who supplied chemical solvents for your greenhouse fire also funneling money through Nathan's accounts. It wasn't just fraud, it was intimidation. He wanted to shake you, to make sure you thought twice before expanding your hold on the board." Victoria stared at the documents, her eyes flicking over numbers that blurred into one another. She had lived her entire career among contracts and balance sheets, but tonight the lines carried a different weight. They weren't just figures. They were the blueprint of betrayal, of someone who had once shared her bed, now trying to destroy her life piece by piece. Ava Lawrence sat on the far side of the room, her makeup streaked from tears, her once flawless composure gone. She broke down as Murphy laid out the evidence. "I thought it was just business," she said between sobs. "He told me it was about leverage, about teaching you a lesson. I didn't know it went this far. I didn't know about the fire." Her voice cracked and she buried her face in her hands. Victoria didn't answer her. She couldn't. She felt cold, hollow, a mixture of vindication and grief. The fire had haunted her for a year, and now the truth stood naked before her. Yet instead of triumph, she felt the sting of what had been lost. The greenhouse that had once symbolized her independence. The betrayal she had forced herself to ignore, when rumors first whispered Nathan's name. Murphy gathered the files, then paused. "One more thing," he said, his tone softening. He pulled out his phone, sliding it across the table. On the screen was an email chain, anonymous tips, forwarded documents, transcribed recordings. The sender's name, Finch. "That was the turning point," Murphy explained. "Whoever this was, they gave me exactly what I needed. Without it, Nathan would have slipped through my fingers again." Victoria's gaze shifted to Ethan. He sat quietly at the corner of the table, his hands folded, his face unreadable. But his silence told her more than words. "It was you," she whispered. He finally looked at her, his dark eyes steady. "I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Not when I knew what he'd done." "Why call yourself Finch?" she asked, her voice trembling. He leaned back slightly, his expression softening. "Sophia once nursed a bird back to health. A small finch. Broken wing, couldn't fly straight, but it kept trying, and one day it took off anyway. I figured if something that fragile could keep going, so could we. It felt right." Victoria pressed a hand to her mouth, overcome. She had built her life on power, on control, on the image of being unbreakable. But here was a man who had lived through grief, through struggle, through loneliness. And instead of hiding his scars, he had turned them into quiet strength. He hadn't spoken a word about it until now, and only because the truth demanded it. Another knock came at the door, and a woman entered, someone Victoria vaguely recognized as the wife of a night guard injured during the greenhouse fire. She carried a small folder, her hands trembling. "I don't mean to intrude," she said softly, her voice quivering, "but I think you should know. When the insurance dragged their feet paying my husband's medical bills, someone sent money, enough to cover the surgery. I tracked the transfer once. It was signed Finch." Her eyes shifted to Ethan. "You sold your wife's wedding ring for that, didn't you?" Ethan said nothing, but the silence itself was confirmation. Victoria felt her chest tighten, her throat sting. Tears blurred her vision, spilling hot down her cheeks. For years she had hidden every weakness, fought every battle alone. Yet the man the world dismissed as a gardener had quietly borne burdens for others, not for recognition, not for gain, but because he could not do otherwise. She reached across the table, her hand finding his. His skin was rough, calloused, but solid, grounding her in a way nothing else had that night. For once, she didn't try to control the tremor in her voice. "You've carried more than anyone knows," she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence, as always, spoke louder than words. When dawn finally broke over the vineyard, painting the hills in pale gold, Victoria stepped outside the station into the cool morning air. She should have felt exhausted, shattered, but instead there was a strange clarity inside her. The war with Nathan was far from over, but she no longer felt trapped in it. Beside her, Ethan walked quietly, his daughter's name etched into every step he took. And for the first time in years, Victoria Hale, the millionaire CEO who had taught herself never to lean on anyone, realized she wasn't alone anymore. The scandal exploded like wildfire. By the following week, every business column, gossip site, and nightly news broadcast was plastered with Nathan Parker's name. Headlines screamed about fraud, insurance crimes, intimidation, and betrayal. His mugshot was replayed endlessly, his face drained of charm and arrogance, now a hollow reflection of the man who had once smirked across boardrooms. Investors distanced themselves. Former allies cut ties. For Victoria Hale, the fallout was vindication, but also a storm she had to navigate with precision. She was no longer merely a CEO fighting to prove herself in a male-dominated boardroom. She had become a symbol of both victimhood and defiance. And symbols were always scrutinized. Inside the sleek conference room of Hale Dynamics, the board sat stiff and uneasy. Men in dark suits, women with measured gazes, all shifting in their seats as if afraid of contagion. The chairman cleared his throat, his tone polished but lined with unease. "Victoria, with all due respect, this exposure threatens the stability of our brand. The public will inevitably associate your personal history with the company's image. We must manage reputational risk." Victoria rose slowly, every inch of her posture deliberate, every movement rehearsed from years of combat in this exact arena. She placed both hands on the table, leaning forward, her dark hair falling like a curtain before her determined face. Reputational risk, she repeated, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut. The greater risk is living among people and failing to see them. You talk about brand as if it's made of glass, but a brand is only as strong as the people who hold it up. The silence was taut. She let it hang, then drove her words deeper. I made a mistake marrying Nathan Parker. That mistake belongs to me, not this company. If you want to hold me accountable for my personal choices, then do it openly, here and now. But understand this. I will not allow Hale Dynamics to become a company that trembles at shadows. We do not bend to criminals. We do not hide when faced with fire. And if my board cannot stand with me in that, then perhaps it is not me who doesn't belong here. There was a long pause. Some board members looked away. Others shifted in discomfort. None spoke. They knew her words carried more strength than their polished fears. Victoria straightened, smoothing her suit jacket, and walked out of the room with the kind of poise that could not be feigned. Outside, the air was cooler, quieter. She spotted Ethan waiting near the parking lot, leaning casually against his old truck. His sleeves rolled up, a faint streak of dirt still on his forearm, as if he had left the gardens just to be here. He wasn't dressed for power or spectacle, but the sight of him made something in her chest unclench. "How was the war?" he asked, his voice even, with a hint of dry humor. "Still standing," she replied. She hesitated, then added softer, "Because of you." He tilted his head, his gaze steady but warm. "I only handed you a shovel. You're the one who decided to dig the fire out by the roots." She laughed then, a sound she hadn't expected to escape her lips. For a fleeting moment, the burden of scandal and betrayal felt lighter. But she wasn't finished. She turned toward him fully. "I want to rebuild the greenhouse," she said. "Not as it was before. Bigger, different, a public space, a garden for children, for the elderly, for anyone who needs a place to breathe. Classes, therapy programs, something that grows beyond business." She paused, holding his eyes. "And I want you to lead it." Ethan blinked, his brow furrowing. "Victoria, I'm a gardener. Not a director, not a manager. Just a man who works with dirt." "You're a man who makes things live again," she countered. "And you're the only person I trust with this." He looked down, then back at her, his jaw tightening as though weighing the responsibility against the life he already carried. "If I do this, it's not for prestige," he said at last. "It's for Sophia, for her future, and for the people who need it." "Then we're in agreement," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "One condition, though, a plaque at the entrance, with Sophia's name." Ethan's expression softened, and for a moment, something passed between them, something neither of them had the courage to name. The weeks that followed were a blur of rebuilding. Construction crews tore away the charred remains of the old greenhouse. Volunteers, students, and retirees arrived daily, drawn by the promise of something new. Children carried seedlings in small hands, giggling as dirt smeared their cheeks. Sophia ran through the rows, her laughter brighter than the sunlight streaming through the frames. Ethan oversaw every detail with steady patience, teaching, guiding, working harder than anyone, but never asking for credit. Victoria visited often, not in her usual armor of heels and sharp suits, but in simple clothes, hair pulled back, her hands unafraid to touch soil. The sight startled many who had only known her as the untouchable CEO, but to Ethan, it felt natural. The image of her kneeling beside Sophia, showing the girl how to press a seed into the earth, stayed etched in his mind long after. And slowly, the whispers in the city shifted. Where once there had been gossip about scandal, now there was admiration for resilience. The story was no longer only about a CEO betrayed by her husband. It was about survival, about rebuilding, about finding strength in unexpected places. For Victoria, it wasn't about repairing her reputation anymore. It was about planting something that could outlive the whispers. And every time she walked the rows of the greenhouse, shoulder brushing against Ethan's as they inspected new growth, she knew she was building more than a project. She was building a life that, for the first time in years, didn't feel lonely. Spring arrived with a gentleness that felt almost undeserved after so much chaos. The air was warmer, the rain softer, and the earth seemed eager to forget the fire and scandal that had scorched the year before. Where once there had been the blackened skeleton of Victoria's greenhouse, now rose a space reborn. The new structure was larger, more open. its glass panels gleaming like water under the sun. At its entrance hung a plaque that read, Finch Garden, a place where even broken wings can learn to fly. The words chosen by Ethan carried more weight than any corporate motto Victoria had ever approved in her life. On opening day, the grounds filled with people. Children ran through the rows carrying small pots of seedlings, their laughter echoing between the steel arches. Elderly volunteers knelt carefully by raised beds, their weathered hands steady as they planted herbs and flowers. Students unloaded crates of young plants from trucks, their clothes stained with dirt, but their faces shining with pride. It wasn't a polished gala, not like the events Victoria had once thrown for shareholders. There were no crystal chandeliers or carefully prepared speeches. Instead, there was life, messy, unvarnished, authentic. And for the first time in years, Victoria felt as though she belonged in it. She moved through the crowd quietly, not as a CEO, but simply as herself. No power suit, no immaculate heels, just a simple dress and her hair tied back. She shook hands, helped children press seeds into soil, listened as old men shared stories of farms they'd worked decades earlier. Every moment she felt something settle inside her, a peace she hadn't thought possible. And yet as she walked, her eyes always seemed to find Ethan. He was at the far end of the garden, crouched beside Sophia, showing her how to tuck lavender into the earth with gentle hands. His sleeves were rolled up, his skin tan from hours of labor, his movements steady, patient. Sophia beamed up at him, her small fingers mimicking his as best she could, then laughed when she accidentally dropped too much soil over the plant. Ethan only smiled, brushing the dirt away without scolding her. The image etched itself into Victoria's heart, as if the two of them, father and daughter, were the roots of everything this garden stood for. Later, as the sun dipped low, Detective Murphy arrived, carrying a basket of tomatoes from his own yard. He walked the rows with a look of quiet amazement. You know, he said to Victoria, I've worked cases that ended in ruin for everyone involved. People walk away from courtrooms broken, bitter. But this, he gestured to the greenhouse, to the volunteers, to the laughter that spilled into the twilight. I've never seen people take pain and turn it into something that grows. Victoria smiled, though her eyes burned with emotion. This isn't victory, she said softly. It's a second chance. As evening fell and the last volunteers drifted home, the greenhouse grew quiet. The lanterns along the paths flickered on, casting a golden glow over the plants. Sophia tugged on Ethan's sleeve and asked if she could ride her bike once more before bed. He nodded, watching as she pedaled down the path, her laughter ringing out like a bell. For a long while, Victoria and Ethan stood side by side in silence, listening to the rhythmic squeak of the wheels, the night air sweet with the scent of earth and new blossoms. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice low. You know, I'm still just a gardener. Victoria turned her head toward him, studying the lines of his face in the lantern light. She saw the weariness there, the scars of loss and burden, but also the quiet strength that had carried her through storms she would never have survived alone. A slow smile touched her lips. And I'm still just a millionaire CEO, she said gently. The rest will grow. The words lingered between them, soft and steady, not a promise but an understanding. They didn't need declarations, didn't need grand speeches. What they had was something stronger. Trust forged in fire, loyalty proved in silence, and a bond that had grown slowly, like roots beneath the soil, unseen but unshakable. The sky deepened to indigo, the first stars flickering above. Sophia's laughter faded as she slowed her bike, coasting back toward them, hair flying loose around her face. Ethan reached out to steady her as she jumped off, and Victoria felt her heart swell at the sight. It wasn't the polished life she had once imagined, the one built on glass towers and magazine covers. It was something humbler, messier, infinitely more real. They walked together back toward the cottage at the edge of the estate, Sophia skipping ahead, clutching her worn rabbit toy. The garden glowed behind them, alive with the quiet promise of tomorrow. And as Victoria felt Ethan's hand brush against hers, steady and warm, she knew with certainty that her story was no longer defined by betrayal or loneliness. It was defined by this moment, the smell of damp earth, the glow of lanterns, the sound of a child's laughter, and the shocking, undeniable truth that love had taken root where once there had been only ashes. This isn't simply a tale of betrayal, crime and revenge, It's a story about resilience and the quiet kind of courage that often goes unnoticed. Victoria, the millionaire CEO, begins as someone who believes power and control are her only shields. But in the ashes of her loss, she discovers that true strength isn't built on money or status. It's found in trust, loyalty, and the willingness to be vulnerable. Ethan, the gardener and single father, never sought recognition or heroism. His strength was born from grief, responsibility, and love for his daughter. Yet he becomes the anchor Victoria didn't know she needed. Not because he tried to be a savior, but because he refused to turn away when it mattered most. The ending for me is not about a CEO and a gardener defying expectations. It's about the rebirth of two people who carried scars, hers from betrayal, his from loss, and how together they created something new and alive. The Finch Garden isn't just a greenhouse. It's a symbol of healing, of second chances, of broken wings learning to fly again. What makes this ending powerful is that it shocks not with spectacle, but with simplicity. Love, loyalty, and hope found in the most unexpected place. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning battles in boardrooms or headlines, but from planting roots in the ashes and choosing to grow.